I used this phrase a couple of times recently and people picked up on it with that instinctive recognition. So I thought that I'm going to talk about it. I said that I didn't particularly like someone, but that I trauma bonded with them. Now, films use this as a plot device for putting together unlikely candidates, people who wouldn't have met otherwise or have nothing in common or actively disagree with each other, and put them in a traumatizing situation, something that is emotionally, physically grueling, heavy, something that breaks down their boundaries and puts them in a situation where they feel more intimate with each other, because they've experienced something together that others haven't been a part of. There is a closeness, a familiarity, an intimacy, and that intimacy makes them want to have more of that. It makes them feel like that they are bonded closer together than they would be with other people. And that closeness just wants you to have more and more of that. So they usually romantically get together by the end of the film. Now, the trauma experience doesn't have to be lived experience together. It doesn't have to be experienced between the two of them at the same time. It can be spread out over time and space, because I quite sardonically believe that every single child on this planet has a traumatizing childhood. The baseline definition of trauma is just something that is overwhelming for your nervous system. When you're encountering a situation, and it can be one major event or a series of low-level stressful situations that add up over time, the very fact that it's repeating without it changing, the very fact of this hopeless repetition that just grinds you day by day or over time. Those events can trigger big words, PTSD and CPTSD. You don't have to go to war and come back with all sorts of flashback trauma wounds for you to have PTSD, especially complex PTSD, CPTSD. And we're going to be talking way more than necessary about healing trauma. But trauma bonding happens between people who have not dealt with their trauma as of yet. They haven't healed them. They might have not even addressed those trauma situations. So their familiar baseline nervous system recognition is still existing in that traumatized state. When you encounter something overwhelming, physically, emotionally, sexually, financially, any situation that you don't feel equipped to handle at the time, which is bound to happen at some point in everyone's childhood. Even if we had a very nice, very loving, very kind, very soulful childhood, at some point something happened in there that was too much for our nervous system. And if we haven't addressed that, if we haven't integrated that, if we haven't managed to involve that experience in a healthy way as a part of ourselves, then it exists in our energy field as a bubble experience. It's almost like you have, say, in your nervous system, in your neurons, you would have flowing lines, free flowing lines of electricity. Like literally that's how your body communicates. That's how I'm able to move my muscles. That's how my mouth is moving right now, because electricity is moving me right now. So there are free flowing lines of electricity going between your spinal cord, your brain, your muscles, in between your muscles, in between all of them is just pure electricity. Now, when you would have a shocking experience, a stressful experience that your body doesn't know what to do with, imagine that as if it would create quite a literal bubble in your energy field. It's a sort of emotional short circuit, or like a circuit break, where you would be able to just free-flowingly communicate information, and all of a sudden information just meets some kind of a block that it doesn't know what to do with. And because of that block, you quite literally, physically, create an electromagnetic shift that doesn't quite belong to the rest of the system. Psychologically, you might be dissociating from this situation. The typical fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, we'll talk about that at some point. The baseline of that is that usually our first response is either fight or flight. We would either defend ourselves and attack the situation or pull away from the situation in order not to get hurt. Now, if we're not really able to do any of that, if we're not able to defend ourselves and if we're not able to pull away from the situation, that's when our freeze response kicks in. And those are the moments when we just don't want to be part of who we are right now. We don't want to participate in our present moment reality. So we check out, and psychologically, we create an alternative space-time for ourselves where it's safe, or we just don't have to deal with the situation. That's what later comes out in your nervous system as numbing or overeating or being addicted to any kind of substances or any kind of habitual experiences. When you want to repeat a feeling state that pulls you out of your present moment reality. In a way, my entire industry, filmmaking, is quite an escapist industry. We're on some level, there's a lot of creativity and there's a lot of wholesomeness in it, and there's a lot of innovation in it, there's a lot of good in it, but on the very baseline level, the what daytime TV used to be or what endless content is nowadays is just numbing out. It's just for us to have something that we consume that is pulling us out of our present experience of where the body is and what we are feeling, sensing right now, right here, because we don't want to engage with that, because it might be a bit too uncomfortable, boring, frightening, anxious, depressed, angry. We might not be in a financial situation that we want to be in. We might not be in a romantic situation that we want to be in. And we don't want to face that. We don't want to face feeling lonely. We don't want to face feeling isolated or incapable or hopeless or helpless. So we try to create an entire different reality for us where we feel safe and secure. Now, it probably is just me, but when I talk to people for long enough, I like looking for patterns. I like pattern recognition in people's emotional makeup. Maybe I'm being too reductive about it, but in my experience, when you talk to someone for long enough in an intimately caring way, they will reveal something personal about themselves that you can empathize with, something that you recognize. Even though your living situation, your circumstances, your social background, your family background, your financial situation, your whatever, the outer circumstances, the actual event might be completely different and you might not have any recognition of that. But the emotional component, how they translated the situation, the story they tell themselves about the events that happened, the interpretation that they dress up onto the skeleton of what happened, that interpretation is familiar. Or if you dig long enough, you will find something that is familiar. Because we might not be painting the same picture, but we are using the same colors. We are painting with the same emotional color palette. And, we might be, that's not the right way of putting it. We have the same emotional color palette available to all of us. And based on the shading, the coloring, the mixture of colors, the shapes, my favorite shapes, the way that we are constructing our image can feel very familiar to someone, even if the actual picture that we painted is new. And based on that emotional familiarity, people feel close to each other. Now, when you trauma bond with someone, it's usually a case of finding that they are using the same emotional color palette, or that they're using it in a way that is very familiar to your nervous system. They have gone through a traumatizing situation that they dealt with very similarly to how you dealt with it. Now, spoiler alert, that is not a healthy way of dealing with it. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a trauma bond. Trauma bonds form between people who have not actually healed their trauma, but they have been using coping mechanisms, have been experiencing feelings that are still quite painful, quite re-traumatizing. And those two struggling and suffering people who don't know how to deal with their own stress, with their own loneliness, with their own isolation, with their own trauma, suddenly recognize something familiar in the other. My trauma bubble experience and your trauma bubble experience somehow starts to merge into each other's experience. It is quite literally an expensive feeling to find someone who feels familiar. It feels the same. It feels like home. Even if home wasn't a good place, it does feel like I know this person. I feel like I should stop right now. The reason why we recognize this situation, the very classic, basic example of that is the attachment styles, when an anxious attached person and an avoidant attached person gets together. Trauma bonds find familiarity in trauma. You would find something familiar with a person who's gone through a similar pain as you have been through. And quite frequently, we date the same person with a different face who in some way, shape, or form reminds us of home, reminds us of the people that hurt us. And the way that we are dealing with our pain, that unhealthy, unhealing way that we're trying to survive, that survival mechanism that we've chosen, those painful emotional color palettes, they match. So you just find more intimacy with the person who's gone through the same, or they interpreted their experience in very similar ways than other people. The trick with trauma bonding is, especially if you go into any kind of group setting, like any kind of group healing situation that is soulful and healthy and not necessarily new age and woo-woo. It doesn't have to be all spiritual. You don't have to be drumming. You don't have to be doing any of that. But if you go into any wholesome healing circle, by the end, 99% sure about it, you will find at least one person who feels exactly the way you're feeling, or who just very deeply, very intimately empathizes with your experience. I'm not gonna go into any deeper than this, but if you feel like that there is a person in your circle, in your system, that you fell in love with, like so immediately, so instantly, and after a while you figure out that you're actually quite unhealthy for each other, you're actually hurting each other in a way that just doesn't feel good. In the beginning, there was this massive dopamine rush of this person just gets me. You just understand who I am, where I come from, how I see the world, and it feels amazing because finally I don't feel so fucking lonely here. But after a while, you just keep pushing each other's buttons. You just rub each other the wrong way in a way that feels familiar, but you don't want to feel that feeling. It's the same way how your mom and dad treated you. It's the same way how your previous relationships have treated you. There is a pattern, there is familiarity, but it feels so awful and you don't want to keep repeating that. That's a trauma bond. That's when you are advised to, you don't need to, you don't have to do anything in this lifetime, but that's when you're advised to look into your own trauma healing, and you will leave behind those bonds more than likely, and you will find people that you can love and connect with intimately in a healthy way and can feel more nurturing and nourishing familiarity with them from a space where you feel wholesome and healthy rather than feeling close to them from a space of we've been hurt the same way.